This is Akashvani. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring a discussion on India's G20 Presidency, trade and investment priorities, and significance of B20 summit. The participants are economic analyst Maithili Bushnur Mutt and Shishir Sinha, and Gaurav Dhawanlal, anchor.
India's G20 Presidency, trade and investment priorities and significance of the B20 summit. Wanting to begin with you, Shishir. In fact, the finance minister today at the B20 summit, and just to give a context, the B20 is the official forum with the global business community, and the finance minister addressed this. Some important sharings happened. Let's begin with that. What are some of the salient features?
Gaurav, if you can distribute the entire FME speech into three parts, that will give a sense of what she wanted to say. The first part was on the overall Indian economic situation, how we are doing, how we are growing, what kind of opportunities we have, what kind of investment opportunities we have, and how we need to invite the investment. This was the first part. The second part, as the topic was, what could be the strategy for sustainable global growth? So she gave 5-point agenda. And the first point, which was most important, was the obsession for the interest rate. Because most of the central banks, whether we talk about the Federal Reserve or whether we talk about any of the European central bank, they all are talking about raising the interest rate to check the inflation. So finance minister cautioned about raising the interest rate, keeping in mind the growth prospect. The second part of that 5-point agenda was on more and more investment on health and education. Of course, there were the other points were talking about how to boost the public investment so that it could become kind of hand-holding for the private sector. So this was the second part. And the third part, which was very important, at this moment when we are talking about how China is slowing down and what kind of impact it is going to have on India and on other economies. So she specifically mentioned that when we talk about China, of course, it is a matter of concern for a country like us, but we should speak more about us rather than slowing down of economy in China or the problems in China and what kind of opportunities we are ready to offer to the world. So these were the three key critical points of our speech. Overall, the tone was very positive, and the most important thing, she wanted to highlight that what India has to offer to the world, considering the global growth slowing down, but India is the fastest growing economy.
Maithili, coming to you, one of the remarks in her speech was the finance minister said green shoots of private capital expenditure are now showing up. And even in the B20, we keep hearing words and keeping in tune with their theme, responsive, accelerated, innovative, creative. How excited do you think private sector is now about the next curve that India is going to take and their participation?
Private sector investment has been very tardy in the country in the past few days. Unfortunately, public sector investment has held up. Government has really played its role of leading from the front. But the question is that government cannot go on investing because ultimately government is constrained by resources. We are a poor country and government has many other things to invest on. Public investment can only go thus far. So we do need the private sector to step in. So far, we haven't seen that happen. Yes, there are some green shoots and these green shoots are sustained. That is the most important thing because in the past, interest rates were low, but we didn't see private investment coming in. Now, because of the fight against inflation, central banks across the world have no option but to raise interest rates. So we have to hope that the private sector will realize that they have to step into the breach, and as the population and the people start spending and consumption picks up, capacity utilization increases, then the private sector will come forth and invest. So that really is the hope, because as the B20, it's a dialogue forum with global business community, and we do want overseas investments, foreign investment. And we want to tell foreign investment that we are open to business and India is a good place to invest. We have the advantages of being the largest population now in the world. We are growing very much more rapidly than the rest of the world. So we are open for business. Please come here. And so we want to send that message across. And the G20 is a very good forum, and the B20 within that is a very good forum to do that.
So do you think in terms of inviting capital expenditure, do you think that domestic capital expenditure from the private sector is tougher to, invite in, and foreign capital expenditure is easier probably because some incentivization? Are we looking at a different structure of incentivization, or is it more of an attitudinal or a background issue?
Ultimately, business everywhere, whether it is in India or overseas, is driven by profits. So if they see markets, if they see profit, and if they see it's easy to do business in India, overseas investors will come. Now, domestic investors also want exactly the same things. They want ready markets, they want easy to do business, and they know India much better than overseas investors. In fact, I would think that domestic capital has one huge advantage because this is familiar territory for them. To the overseas investors, they're not so familiar with India, which is why you see many overseas investors initially prefer to come with Indian partners. We have no problem with that also, but the Indian partner gives you the leeway, the knowledge about the Indian market, which is very important.
In fact, Shishir, wanting to understand from you, there are some challenges also which were mentioned directly and some laterally also, like supply chain is an area of focus. We need to make sure that is in our control, climate change and climate investment. So what is your take on how do you think the world is going to respond to actually India's demand for saying, we want climate financing? It's very, very critical.
Of course, it is very critical. And if you see the Paris Agreement, where there's supposed to be a commitment of $100 billion, it came after a lot of persuasion. So that money has come, but it has taken a lot of time. And the thought of bringing $100 billion, when it was thought, the situation was entirely different. Now the situation is entirely different. So the big question is whether that $100 billion is sufficient or not, that we have to think. The other thing is that there are still differences among some of the economies on these issues, especially about the carbon emission. Many of the time we get a complaint that the developed nations are more into carbon emission, but they always accuse or they always blame the developing nations or the emerging nations for that. So there are differences on that front also, and that is also one of the challenge of getting finance to address this issue. The other issue is that you must have gone through the IMF for working paper on fossil fuel subsidy, and if you see that paper, explicit subsidy is much less and implicit subsidy is much higher. That is also a cause of concern, because what we can say, we are not taking into consideration that what kind of impact we are going to have on the overall environment because of the use of the fossil fuel, continuous use of that, and not giving much for the other sources of energy. So these are some of the issues which need to be discussed, and what we understand that during the leadership summit, this will also be a part of overall discussion, because we have seen that during all those meetings, whether it is the FMCBG or the trade and industry or even the other sectoral meetings, this issue has figured, but more what you can say authoritative line we are expecting during the leadership summit and how to address the challenge.
Nicely, in terms of China, the FM also said it's an area of concern and the situation, and we're watching it. Do you sense an opportunity for India?
Well, we have been talking about an opportunity in India for a while. In fact, there's been talk of China plus one, but we haven't unfortunately seen that much investment as we would have hoped. A lot of the investment which was earlier going to China has tended to go to Vietnam, Indonesia, and some of the other Southeast Asian countries. But some of the investment, no doubt, has come to India. In fact, one of the huge advantages we have is in terms of service exports. So even though our IT exports didn't do too well in the last year, service exports, because we are seeing the middle office shifting to India. So services is a big area of strength for India. Goods export has not been that good so far, but we are hoping to get into this global value chains. We missed out on the first round of the global value chains, but now we do hope that we will also be able to get into the global value chains, because the fact is the world has realized, as in the case of chips or anything else, that a complete reliance on any one country is a big mistake. So as the world looks for diversified sources, we hope that India will be a country, and I think it has happened. We are seeing global business increasingly looking at India with greater and greater interest. Automobiles is a classic example. There is not a single global automobile major who doesn't have a presence in India today. And that speaks of the kind of opportunities and the way global business is looking at India with very, very interested eyes.
So you did mention that a lot of that investment, which we thought would come towards India after seeing the China situation, did not really come in. What are some areas that we really need to pull up our socks so that we are very, very exciting and people want to come in?
Problem really in India is the government has come up with schemes like PLI. Initially, there was a lot of criticism, but the fact remains that the PLI scheme, particularly in the context of mobiles, has really delivered not only in terms of exports, but also more importantly in terms of jobs. So I think the government has been doing a fair amount, but you must also remember that in smaller countries which have fewer problems, it is easier for government to introduce a policy and ensure that it is followed through. In a democracy, and a large, diverse democracy like us, it is not so easy to ensure that that whatever government says on paper is immediately translated into practice on the ground. So given those kind of difficulties, I think we have not fared too badly. The very fact that we are growing very strongly does give credence to the fact that we are slowly and surely getting there. Remember, it was everybody compared China with India and put India unfavorably. But now you have to rethink, is the India model more sustainable in the long run? Has the China model come to an end? I think these are the questions that the world needs to think about and think about seriously.
I think you're stating that it is actually about the long run, because sustainability, we always look at sustainability, but somehow we miss up on the term. Sustainability is over a period of time, and that takes a little longer time to manifest. And I think India probably, by virtue of its, nature and historical tradition, or whatever we want to call it, of our historical policies, we have actually pitched for the long run and seems to be benefiting us now. Shishir, wanting to understand your take on what are some areas that we really need to actually move up and, not be slow, be quick on the turnaround time.
The most important thing is the coordination between center and states. See what happens that when you want to set up a plant here. So initially you are given all kind of approval from the central government, but various other approvals you need at state level. And there the problem is that the supporting element, or what you can say equally supporting elements, are not there. So we need a kind of more strong coordination between the center and the state, so that there should not be any problem for the investor. See, any investor who is coming to our country, or even the domestic investor who wants to set up a plant in any part of the India, what he or she needs a stable thing, a proper coordinated effort, no problem, and of course the single window kind of thing. Unfortunately, that single window thing is not happening in the way which we were thinking. So that is why you must have noticed that if you're talking about PLI, this PLI is available for 14 sectors. But out of these 14, just 2 or 3 sectors have done well. Remaining 11 sectors have not given the kind of result which we were expecting. And those sectors, there we need more coordination between the center and the state. So I think most important factor at this moment is to how to provide a better ease of doing business at the ground level, not just in terms of some rules or some law here and there.
So Shishir, in terms of, our taxation policy in trade and investment, and earlier Maiti had said, it's profits actually that make people want to invest. How do you think our taxation system, particularly for corporates, is structured? And in terms of the global standards for such structures, how do we fare?
If you can remember that way back in 2019, when the corporate tax was lowered, and also for the newer ventures in the manufacturing sector, it was lowered to a level which is much lesser than many of the Asian economies. So at the taxation level, this level of the taxation is not giving that problem. Another important thing is that after Vodafone matter, we are not going for any kind of retrospective taxation. So these two things are giving comfort to a foreign investor that there is no problem. The only thing what they are expecting, that if they are coming to a place like, say, any of the state, there they should get more and more cooperation from that state also. Because the taxation, if we talk about from the central government level, there is no problem. Because of the GST, you don't have to think about the state taxation. The only thing you have to think about that what kind of support, logistic support, infrastructure support, and various kind of approval support from the state governments are being given to an investor.
Maitli, when we talk of trade and investment, and we want other countries to come also and trade with them and invest with us, why would they want to come to India other than a big market? What are some strengths that we are very well positioned in the world?
Well, as I said, the market is a huge advantage, is a huge strength, and no corporate will want to ignore that. The second is that I think we have skilled labor force, and at a fraction of the price also becomes a huge advantage for corporates looking to invest. The third, I think, is our location. We are located in a part of the world where demand is not saturated yet. How many televisions will you sell to an American? How many cars will you sell to an American? Whereas South Asia, and we're not so far from Africa, these are countries which are growing, where there is a demand, where people are not satiated. So I think India has a good geographical location. We have the huge advantage of a democracy, because classic example, I think Shishi talked about Vodafone. The fact remains that Vodafone could go to court against the government of the country. This is unimaginable in a country like China. So I I think our democracy is both a strength and at times, as I said, a weakness. The simple fact that the land acquisition bill could not be, passed and land acquisition remains a big stumbling block in India is also reflects the flip side of democracy. It has to be accepted by the people. But precisely because of the fact that when it is accepted, it carries the weight of the entire population, or at least a majority of it, means there's no turning back. Which is why I say maybe long term, God knows whether we're going to see the long term in my lifetime, but long term, it does look as if the India model, where you carry people along with you, is the more sustainable way to go forward.
So in terms of, I think two concerns which are currently doing the rounds. One is, of course, and the FM also flagged it, inflation, and we're expecting it to stay for some time. And the other is employment. In terms of these two, how do you see us faring soon?
Well, inflation is a problem. The Reserve Bank woke up a little late, but it was in common with many other central banks because we've seen inflation has been a problem all over the world. So one cannot blame our central bank alone for that. So inflation is a problem. And the fact is that food is a very major component of the consumption basket of the average Indian. It's always so. In poor countries, food is a large part of your component of your expenditure. Given the fact that we've seen this disruption, particularly in the case of tomato prices, vegetable prices, and now cereal prices because of the war in Ukraine, inflation has been driven mainly by food and beverages. And also, of course, we're dependent on oil. So to the extent that oil prices go up, there's very little that the central bank can really do. So inflation is a problem. We are hoping that this temporary spike that we have seen in inflation is temporary and it does not you don't have what we call the second order effects and doesn't get entrenched. But the problem really is that the only weapon that the central bank has is to raise interest rates, which is why I think just recently we've heard the governor say that we need supply side responses from the government to augment supply. So government has done things like restricting the export of rice, non-basmati rice, on onions, but then that also impacts the farmers. So that's why in a democracy, you have to balance the interests of both the consumers and the producer. It's a tough tightrope walk. So both the government and the RBI are trying their best, and let's hope they succeed.
Right. Yeah. Let's hope for all of us, definitely. And as you said, for the long run for India. Shishir, coming to you now. Maithili mentioned skilled labor is an asset. We also know that traditionally across the globe for many, many years, the free movement of capital happily accepted. Countries are happy to accept each other's capital. Free movement of labor has always been an issue. And I think somewhere this disparity of how the world sees free movement of labor and we have skilled labor, do you think this easing up or the dynamics of the world changing in this?
It will take some time. Still, there are some restrictions in free movement of labor, particularly with some of the countries. So that is one issue which all the economies are facing, not just India or any other economy. The other thing is that when we talk about the movement of labor, it is not just between two countries. We also have to think about the intra-country movement of the labor. How is the movement is and whether they are adopted by that changing environment, that changing scenario or not. There we also have to think about not just skilling, but we also have to think about the continuous upskilling and reskilling. The good thing is that we have a dedicated ministry, we have some dedicated programs for all those things. And also what we are seeing that the acceptance of labor in terms of the intra-country movement is also accepted. But the problem is the inter-country movement. There are still some issues with one or two particular countries whom we need along with the investment. So until that does not happen, we will have some kind of issues in terms of labor.
So India is actually very, very happy and proud of the presidency that we've been leading this forum for some time. And we are moving up to the culmination. The 3 days, 8th, 9th and 10th of September are important again in terms of the Comedy of Nations for India. How different do you think, and Maithili, coming to you with this question first, how different do you think or how special has our presidency been?
Well, I think our presidency is very special because actually we're the second emerging market to hold the presidency. We got it from Indonesia and it's going to be passed on to Brazil. And after that, it's South Africa. So this is an opportunity. We really represent the hopes and aspirations of the entire developing world. And I think this is an opportunity for us to showcase to the world how far we've come. This is not to deny that we have a long way to go, but to show the very fact that, yes, we are a country which is open for business and we want you to come. We will try and, roll out the red carpet for you. And yes, there will be glitches for sure. But if there are glitches, you don't have to worry about where you have to knock there are doors that you can knock and you should knock, and we are open to taking it as far possible as we can. So I think that really is a message. And we really want to drive home the fact that things like the WTO, because we believe in a rule-based multilateral forum for global trade. And we also want to talk in terms of reform of World Bank, the IMF, which essentially represent Western powers who are post-World War II powers. Increasingly, these organizations must represent the emerging world order, which is why I think we have identified 5 priority areas: trade for growth and prosperity, resilient trade, global value chains, and we've also kind of putting emphasis on the micro, small, and medium enterprises. These are very important, particularly in the developing world. Reform of the WTO. So I think we have rightly identified 5 priority areas. And I think this is where we really need to focus on and see some forward movement here.
Right. Shishir, your take on India's G20 presidency?
I think if we sum up the entire 1 year deliberations and discussion, the most important thing that India has shown that it is a kind of a power which nobody can ignore. Of course, this was something some years back also, but now that has been established. Number two, that we are a business-friendly country. We are ready to welcome who come and invest in our country. And we are also ready to facilitate others. It is not just that we are doing something for us only. We are working for the global economy. So India has shown that it is one of the global leaders and it is trying to lay down the path for the sustainable development and sustainable growth of the global economy, not just of the Indian economy.
Maithili, you spoke about MSMEs, and in terms of the developing world, the Prime Minister has also spoken about South-South cooperation. And I think somewhere to understand that, with equity being a critical value with which our governance has happened, so MSMEs and their ability to create employment and engagement, because they're still struggling, whether it's in this country or other developing countries, what are some things that we can actually do? And, this is the G20 summit and this B20 meeting, they're in impetus and a lot of conversations are happening. So wanting to just open up this space to say, what are some things we can do to really give a good heads up or a push up to the MSMEs?
Well, I think one of the big things that India has already done, and we're still working on it, but I think this is almost a job which is done, is that of digitization. It's made a huge difference to the MSME sector.
Right.
So if we have, a program of another program of the government, which I think also offers a great deal of promise, is the open network for digital commerce. This will really democratize our digital marketplace. Today, we are dependent on the Amazons of the world, but tomorrow that need not be so. A small micro enterprise will find it very difficult to offer its products on the Amazon platform. But with the ONDC, which the government is really pushing, and things like, mobile wallets, UPI, etc., I think it's going to make much, much, much easier for small and micro enterprises to reach both their consumers as well as also in order to terms of their suppliers. So I think they'll be able to push out the middleman. And that really, I think, is a promise, digitization, and the way we're kind of trying to push forward, giving them access to marketplaces, which otherwise they wouldn't be able to. That really is, I think, the hope for the future, because MSMEs account for almost 70% of the employment and contribute to almost, 30% of our GDP. So that's a huge number. So I think that's where we really need to focus on, and the government is focusing on that.
Right. And I think you're spot on in terms of housing technology has really helped level their playing field. Shishir, coming to you now to understand that South-South cooperation, India a regional leader, what are some areas that India can actually take its strengths to other developing nations?
The most important thing, the digital thing. And we all know that in terms of UPI, what India is offering to other nations, that what kind of infrastructure we have. And the most important thing, that the cost of developing that infrastructure is so low and the cost of transaction is so low that it has become a kind of template for many other nations. And that is why we are seeing interest from many other economies in our digital payment mechanism. The other thing I just like to add, Maithili was talking about the MSME thing. When we are talking about the MSME, and we are trying to provide a kind of environment to sell their produce, the one policy measure which has been initiated by the government, that they do not require to have the GST registration to sell their products on the e-commerce website. That is a very big thing. So on the one hand, you have the digital infrastructure to facilitate the payment. On the other hand, you don't have to comply with all kind of GST things. in providing a better platform for MSME. And that also can be replicated for many other economies, and many other economies where the MSMEs have a bigger role. They can also think of providing some kind of initiative, some kind of what you can say facilitation to their units, adopting what India has done.
So do you think, Shishir, in terms of, one of the challenges that we always faced with MSMEs was that, bigger companies have better quality control. They are able to produce more standardized products. You can be sure that if it's coming from that company, there is a certain value to it. So in the MSME sector, you think that we've really moved up in our quality control?
They have improved a lot, and that is why if you talk about the share in GDP, that's something around 30%. You also think of their share in export, it is 48%. So if they are contributing almost 48% from the export, it cannot happen without any quality. So they have done something. Of course, there's always an opportunity to improve from where we are. But what we understand and what we believe that MSMEs are doing well on the quality front, and they are continuing on that front, and with the help of all kind of incentive from the government in trying to have a better mechanism for quality check and all those things, they will continue to do so. I don't see any problem in terms of the quality. There may be some areas where the quality may not be the same what we think that should be, but the larger issue is that they have improved and they are improving.
So now, wanting to draw the attention of both you, Maitli and Shishir, to education. It's a backward and a forward linkage issue, and we spoke of skilled labor. Labor is something that in India is, we're wanting to reap a demographic dividend. So yes, we are like human resource basin of the world, of the growing world. In terms of education and skilling, do you think that we really are at par with the industry wants? Because there's invariably been a mismatch between what we produce in terms of education and the qualifications and what the industry needs. Do you think there's greater synchronicity happening here, or a greater meeting of minds happening here?
Well, this is essentially a work in progress, and we just started down the road. Because unfortunately, what you say is entirely correct. Most of industry complains of the kind of people they get when they recruit from our colleges. They are completely unfit for the job, and they have to learn on the job. So this is where I think things like ITIs play a very important role. And we have been trying over the past few years to upgrade our ITIs and give them greater attention. It's not necessary that you have to go to an IIT to get a good job. As we've seen in the case of ISRO, I don't know whether you have read, there's just a very interesting piece, I think, perhaps by Shashi Tharoor, which says that in fact, almost very few of the team which led the ISRO effort were actually from IITs. They were all people who studied in India and were good scientists from Indian colleges, Indian institutions. Right. So I think that's what we really need to do to take pride in things like vocational training, ITIs, and get people, give them the skills, not just the bookish knowledge. So that I think is something that is still very much a work in progress, and we need to work much harder on that.
Your point about vocational training, very well made. We've always struggled. There's always been a bias in terms of, how do you see in the hierarchy of education, vocational training, but actually it is an area of strength if we can really move in on this. Shishir, your inputs on education and industry, match or mismatch?
The most important thing is how we can be innovative in that area, because the real issue, whenever you talk to industry, they say that we are not getting people according to our requirement. And we always struggle with changing the syllabus. We always struggle with providing a kind of infrastructure. So there we need to have a real-time kind of mechanism where the industry demand can be incorporated in the syllabus through the innovative means. Just repeating the old syllabus is not going to solve our problem. Even just changing the terms of primary education and the secondary education, not going to solve the problem. The real problem is that whether our syllabus are according to the requirement of the changing scenario or not. And that changes should be continuous process, not a 5-year or 7-year kind of thing. If we are able to do so, that will certainly help. And I agree with you that it is a work in progress. It cannot happen overnight, but a strategy can be made right now, and we can start working on that.
In fact, sustainability and the long run is what we're working on right now. Immense possibilities and diversity in so many ways. Well, your opinions are also diverse. Lovely. They made the program so much more powerful. Maitli Bhusnurmat and Shishir Sinha, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on India's G20 Presidency, trade and investment priorities and significance of B20 summit. The participants were economic analyst Maithili Bhusnurmat and Shishir Sinha, and Gaura Dhawanlal, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on a YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.